The mystery of the forgotten cemeteries. I have always felt a strange fascination with cemeteries. Not the grand and well-known ones, with their neat graves and well-tended paths, but those that seem to have been swallowed by time, forgotten by everyone except for the nature that reclaims them. Every time I discover one of these places, abandoned in the shadow of oblivion, I feel as though I am about to open a door to a world that, although distant, remains latent in the silence. I remember the first time I found one of these forgotten cemeteries. I was driving down a rural road, surrounded by hills and dense forests, when something suddenly caught my attention. Off to the side of the road, among the trees and underbrush, I saw what appeared to be gravestones covered in moss, barely visible after years of neglect. The place seemed so out of place, so devoid of human presence, that I couldn't help but stop. The air was dense, laden with that stillness only found in places where time seems to have ceased to exist. I ventured in cautiously, pushing aside dry branches and navigating roots that seemed to have clung to the ground with the intention of protecting that sacred place. As I walked among the gravestones, I felt a mix of reverence and mystery. There were names engraved on the stone, some almost erased by the years, others still legible, but all sharing the same fate, oblivion. Who were these people? How did they live their lives? And most unsettling of all, why does no one remember their names? The grave spoke to me of times past, of stories buried alongside the bodies resting beneath them. Some gravestones were so ancient they seemed like they might crumble with the lightest touch. Others, leaning under the weight of the years, seemed to whisper secrets in tongues that no one understands anymore. There was something profoundly enigmatic about this place, something that made me feel that the past was present, watching me as I explored among its relics. As I ventured further, a feeling of unease began to take hold of me. The silence was so absolute that my footsteps seemed to resonate with a distant echo, as if someone, or something, was listening from the other side. At that moment, I realized that cemeteries are not just places of rest, they are thresholds. Thresholds between the world of the living and the dead, where lines blur and the past seems to want to return. Nature, which had taken control of the place, had transformed that cemetery into something almost unreal. The roots of the trees embraced the graves, as if they wanted to protect the secrets they held. The branches whispered with the wind, like voices of those who are no longer here. There was an unsettling beauty in that fusion of life and death, of the natural and the supernatural. But there were also questions. Questions that I could not ignore. Why was this cemetery abandoned? What happened to the families who once came here to mourn their loved ones? And, more importantly, what stories are buried alongside them? I couldn't help but wonder if these forgotten cemeteries hold more than just the remains of those who once walked the earth. Could there be something more? Something that is only revealed when time, solitude, and oblivion meet in places like this. There is something deeply disturbing about the idea that these dead have not only been forgotten by people but also by history itself. And yet, their graves remain, resisting the passage of time, as if they refuse to disappear completely. Forgotten cemeteries are time capsules, but they are also mirrors of our own mortality. They remind us that, no matter how much we want to escape death, we will all eventually become part of the earth, and perhaps, if memory is cruel, we too will be forgotten. But the secrets these places hold are not easy to uncover. And that, precisely, is what makes them so fascinating. Because, at heart, cemeteries are not just about the dead. They are also about the living, and about what we choose to remember or leave behind. It's a journey into the unknown, and one that I am willing to share with you. Do you dare to venture into these forgotten cemeteries, where the dead still have something to say? First story, the cemetery on the hill. It was an autumn afternoon when I found the cemetery on the hill. The sky was overcast with gray clouds that seemed to herald a storm, and the wind blew strongly, lifting dry leaves around me. I had been driving for hours through a rural landscape when, in the distance, something made me stop. From the winding road, in the distance, on a small hill, stood what appeared to be a cluster of ancient gravestones, solitary and half-hidden among bare trees. The sight immediately captivated me. There was something melancholic and magnetic about that place. I decided to get out of the car and explore. The path to the hill wasn't easy. There were no clear trails, just a rough field covered in underbrush that made each step difficult. As I climbed, the wind grew stronger, and soon I felt the icy air hitting my face, as if nature itself wanted to dissuade me from reaching my destination. As I approached, I noticed the stillness of the place. The wind was the only thing breaking the silence, but even its whisper seemed muted, as if that cemetery on the hill existed in a kind of temporal bubble, separate from the world. Finally, I reached the top, and what I saw took my breath away. Before me, scattered at random, were dozens of leaning gravestones, some broken, others devoured by underbrush. Many were covered in moss, and the inscriptions were barely readable. I crouched by one of the graves, trying to decipher the words carved into the stone. Marta L. 1823 to 1880 was all I could make out. Who was Marta? What kind of life did she lead? I looked around and realized there were no signs of any nearby community. It was strange. Why was this cemetery so isolated? Why would someone be buried in such a remote place, far from any sign of life? The wind brought with it a faint moan, like a distant echo, and suddenly I felt watched. I looked around, but there was no one. Only the creaking of branches and the sound of leaves carried by the wind accompanied my thoughts. However, that feeling of being watched persisted. The air around me seemed charged with something indescribable, as if each of those graves held a secret waiting to be uncovered. I approached another gravestone, larger than the others but equally worn by time. This time, the words were even harder to read. However, one detail caught my attention. At the foot of the grave was a bouquet of withered flowers. They were no more than a week old. Someone had been here recently. But who? The place seemed so abandoned that I didn't imagine anyone visiting it. It was as if time had forgotten this cemetery on the hill, yet someone had broken that forgetfulness. It was then that I heard something. A whisper. It wasn't the wind. It was clear and distinct, almost like a murmur coming from behind one of the gravestones. My heart raced, and although my instinct told me to leave, I couldn't help but move closer to the source of the sound. As I did, the whisper seemed to become clearer, though I still couldn't understand the words. I reached a particularly tilted gravestone, half buried in the ground. I knelt and, with my hands, tried to clear it a bit. Upon touching the cold stone, I felt a strange connection, as if the past was trying to make its way to me. The words on the gravestone were almost unrecognizable, but something caught my eye. Next to the inscription, someone had recently carved a series of strange symbols that I did not recognize. They didn't seem to be part of the original inscription. My mind raced. What did these symbols mean? Who had carved them? And most importantly, why? The wind blew again, stronger this time, and for a moment, I felt a presence behind me. I turned quickly, but there was no one. Only the endless desolate landscape, the dark sky, and those silent, eternal graves. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was there with me. I decided to investigate a bit more. Perhaps those symbols had some meaning. I took out my phone and took some photos, making sure to capture every detail. As I did, I heard the whisper again, but this time it was closer, clearer. It sounded like a female voice, although the words were still incomprehensible. The wind swirled the leaves around me, and the sound of dry branches crackled under my feet. My heart pounded, and a part of me wanted to run, but something kept me anchored to that place. It was as if the cemetery on the hill didn't want to let me go. I decided to walk a bit more, circling the perimeter of the cemetery. Each step I took plunged me further into that unsettling environment, where the visible and the invisible seemed to coexist. That's when I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. In the distance, at the edge of the cemetery, where the terrain began to slope abruptly towards the forest, I saw a figure. It was a woman, or at least it seemed that way from afar. She was motionless, staring in my direction, though it was hard to distinguish clearly between the shadows and the fading light. My body tensed. I couldn't take my eyes off her. "Who are you?" I asked aloud, though the wind seemed to swallow my words. The figure didn't respond. She simply remained there, like a statue, unmoving. I took a step forward, and then she disappeared, as if she had never been there. Fear surged through me, but curiosity was stronger. I ran to the spot where I had seen her, but there was no trace of her, no footprints, no signs that anyone else had been there. The cemetery on the hill held secrets that, for some reason, had remained buried for a long time. I decided I would return with more resources, perhaps with someone else, to try to unravel the mystery of those symbols and the unsettling presence I had felt. But that feeling of being watched, of not being alone in that place, stayed with me throughout the descent of the hill, until I reached my car again. The sun was beginning to set, and the long shadows of the gravestones seemed to bid farewell as I left. As I drove back, I couldn't stop thinking about that cemetery on the hill. About the woman, the symbols, the forgotten graves. And the questions that still had no answers. Who had left the flowers? What did the symbols carved on the gravestone mean? And who was the figure I had seen, or thought I had seen? The cemetery on the hill had given me more questions than answers, but something told me that the true story of that place was yet to be uncovered. And I knew I wouldn't rest until I discovered it. Second story, the treasures intertwined with death. I have always had a strange fascination with old cemeteries. It's as if each grave, each weathered stone, tells an untold story, a whisper from the past. But it wasn't until I heard rumors about the cemetery in a small coastal town that my curiosity turned into obsession. According to local stories, that cemetery hid more than forgotten graves. It was said that beneath the earth lay valuable treasures, buried alongside their owners centuries ago. The idea of finding ancient artifacts or relics intrigued me, but what truly captivated me was the legend surrounding it. They said these treasures were intertwined with death itself, that those who tried to unearth them awakened something more than wealth. Some spoke of vengeful spirits, others of curses that pursued the greedy. They were undoubtedly fantastic stories, but something about them unsettled me. What if there was some truth to these tales? I decided to investigate on my own. I took my car, and after a couple of hours of driving, I arrived at the coastal town that seemed to have been forgotten by time. The streets were narrow and deserted, and the sea breeze blew strongly, filling the air with salt and moisture. The cemetery, referred to by locals as the Field of Treasures, was located on the outskirts, on a cliff overlooking the sea. I made my way there, feeling that each step brought me closer to a place filled with stories, secrets, and perhaps something more. The cemetery wasn't large, but its age was palpable. The graves were scattered irregularly, as if they had been reclaimed by nature over time. Many of the headstones were leaning, some broken, and almost all covered in moss and tall grass. However, there was something about the place that made me feel uneasy, as if I were not alone. It was the kind of sensation that makes you look over your shoulder, expecting to see a shadow moving at the edge of your vision. I decided to start my exploration with one of the oldest graves, which, according to local records, belonged to a ship captain who had shipwrecked centuries ago. The legend said that before he died, he buried part of his ship's treasure in that very cemetery, alongside his own grave. As I examined the stone headstone, I tried to imagine what life had been like for that captain, the adventures he had lived at sea, and of course, if there was really a treasure hidden with him. That's when I heard a sound. It was barely a murmur, as if the wind was carrying words from some corner of the cemetery. I looked around, but I saw no one. The place was completely deserted. Still, I couldn't ignore that feeling of being watched. My instinct told me I should leave, that I wasn't meant to be there. But my curiosity was stronger than my fear. I decided to continue exploring. As I walked among the graves, something caught my eye. It was a headstone that seemed different from the others. It wasn't larger or more ornate, but there was something about it that made me feel uneasy. The inscription was barely discernible, but what I could read left me chilled. Here lies one who protected the unbreakable. Let those who dare disturb his rest pay the price. I stopped for a moment, trying to process what I had just read. What did the unbreakable mean? Did it refer to a treasure or something darker? My heart began to race. The wind blew fiercely, and the branches of nearby trees creaked as if something invisible was moving them. And then I saw it. Right at the foot of that headstone, barely sticking out of the ground, was a small wooden box. It was as if someone or something had deliberately left it there, waiting to be discovered. I knelt down and, with trembling hands, began to dig up the box. It was buried just beneath the surface, as if it had been placed there recently, though the wood seemed old and weathered. When I finally pulled it out, I felt a shiver run through my body. It wasn't an ordinary box. It was decorated with intricate carvings that I couldn't recognize, symbols that seemed older than the cemetery itself. I slowly opened the box, my mind torn between fear and excitement. Inside, wrapped in a tattered silk cloth, were several objects. One of them was a heavy gold medallion decorated with the same symbols that adorned the box. There was also a silver ring, darkened with age, and what appeared to be a small rolled-up parchment. Before I could examine the contents more closely, I heard that murmur again. But this time, it was different. It wasn't the wind. It was a voice, clear and distinct, seeming to come directly from the earth. "Return it," said the voice, in a soft but warning tone. I jumped to my feet, looking around with my heart in my throat. There was no one. "Who's there?" I shouted, though a part of me already knew the answer. The cemetery was not empty. Something or someone was there, watching me, waiting for me to make a decision. I could feel its presence, thick as an invisible fog. My mind began to fill with images. I visualized the captain, burying his treasure with trembling hands, fearing not only for his life, but for what his death would mean for the objects he had protected for so long. "Return it," the voice repeated, this time louder, more insistent. I felt the weight of the medallion in my hand, and in that moment I understood what I had to do. The cemetery was not just a resting place for the dead, it was a guardian of secrets that should not be unearthed. The treasures intertwined with death were not merely objects of material value, they were imbued with an energy that did not belong to the world of the living. I quickly placed the objects back in the box and buried it again in its place, making sure to cover it well with soil. When I finished, the wind, which had been blowing fiercely, suddenly calmed. The murmur ceased, and the cemetery returned to its unsettling quiet. As I walked away, I couldn't help but think about the warning carved on the headstone, "Let those who dare disturb his rest pay the price." I didn't know exactly what it meant, but one thing was clear: the treasures buried in that cemetery were not meant to be unearthed. They were destined to remain where they were, forever intertwined with death and the mysteries surrounding that forgotten place. That night, as I drove back, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had experienced. Was it real or a product of my imagination? I wasn't sure, but one thing was clear: I would not return to that cemetery. Some secrets are meant to stay buried, and I had learned that lesson in the most terrifying way possible. Third story, the Mausoleum of Silence. I will never forget the first time I heard about the Mausoleum of Silence. I was in a small antique bookstore in a remote village when an elderly man, with a distant gaze and trembling hands, mentioned its name in a casual conversation. It wasn't what he said that struck me, but how he said it, as if merely speaking about that place was a defiance of something much greater than himself. "The Mausoleum of Silence," he murmured. "Some say it's just a legend, but I saw it with my own eyes. No one leaves the same after entering." My curiosity was instantly piqued. I knew I shouldn't press further, but something inside me urged me to keep asking. The old man seemed hesitant but eventually told me what little he knew: an ancient mausoleum, hidden deep within a forgotten forest, that had remained untouched for centuries. According to the legends, its name came from an absolute silence that enveloped anyone who dared to enter. It wasn't the kind of natural silence, but one that made you feel small, insignificant, as if the world ceased to exist the moment you crossed its threshold. "And what happens to those who enter?" I asked, unable to contain myself. The old man stared at me for a long moment before answering. "They don't speak of what they saw there. Those who return changed. As if they left a part of themselves behind." There was something in his voice, in the way he said it, that sent a chill down my spine. Yet, that chill was not enough to deter me. I knew I had to find that mausoleum. Not out of a desire to challenge the unknown, but because of an inexplicable attraction to what he described. Days later, I set out on the journey. The search was not easy. The forest where the mausoleum was said to be hidden was dense, dark, and in many parts, impenetrable. It seemed like a place forgotten by time, where nature had reclaimed its territory, and where humans had no place. Each step I took was accompanied by the crunch of dry branches underfoot and the constant whisper of the wind among the trees. Sunlight barely filtered through the treetops, casting elongated shadows that seemed to move silently. As I progressed, the air grew heavier, as if something was squeezing my chest. After hours of walking, I finally saw it. The mausoleum loomed before me, majestic and terrifying at once. At first glance, it appeared to be an abandoned structure, but there was something in its architecture that conveyed power, as if the stones that made it up held secrets older than the forest itself. The silence that I had been told about was real. From the moment I stepped into the clearing around it, the sound of the wind, the birds, and my own footsteps disappeared. It was as if an invisible bubble enveloped the mausoleum, isolating it completely from the rest of the world. I approached slowly, feeling that each step was an act of defiance. The entrance of the mausoleum was guarded by two angel statues, their faces serene but with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. Their empty eyes seemed to watch me, judging my presence. The stone door, heavy and covered in moss, was ajar just enough to allow me entry. I took a deep breath before stepping inside. I knew something would change the moment I crossed that door, but I couldn't stop myself. My curiosity was too strong. Inside, the air was cold, much colder than it should be. The interior was almost completely dark, except for a faint light filtering through small openings in the ceiling. Despite the darkness, I could make out the outlines of the tombs, each one more elaborate than the last. Some were covered in dust and cobwebs, others seemed immaculate, as if someone had been caring for them until recently. I walked down the main corridor, observing the details on the walls, carvings in stone depicting scenes of pain and suffering. Men and women kneeling, their hands stretched towards the sky, as if begging for something they would never receive. There was something deeply unsettling about those figures, as if the artists who had carved them had known that suffering up close. Then, I felt it. A weight, invisible but crushing, slowly enveloping me. It was as if the silence, that absolute silence, began to take over not just my ears, but my mind. My breathing grew heavier, and the cold became more intense. It was as if the mausoleum was claiming me, as if each second spent there was drawing me deeper into its mystery. But the worst was yet to come. As I ventured further into the mausoleum, I reached a central chamber, where a large marble tomb dominated the space. At its base was a small opening, large enough for a person to pass through. I shouldn't have approached. I knew that. But I did. The air there was so dense I could barely breathe, and the darkness felt alive, as if something or someone was watching from the shadows. I knelt by the opening and looked inside. At first, I saw nothing but darkness. But then, something began to move. It wasn't a shadow or a figure, it was a presence, something I couldn't see with my eyes, but felt in every fiber of my being. My heart pounded, and for a moment, I was paralyzed. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. The silence consumed everything. I felt that if I stayed there for another second, that presence would consume me, drag me into that abyss of darkness. Finally, I managed to back away. My legs trembled, and my hands were as cold as the marble beneath my feet. I ran out of the chamber, not looking back, racing down the corridor. The mausoleum seemed to have become darker, more oppressive, as if it didn't want to let me go. But something, perhaps the will to survive, pushed me towards the exit. When I crossed the door, the fresh air of the forest hit me like a gust of life. The silence was still there, but it was different. It was the silence of the natural world, one that now felt almost comforting compared to the oppressive void of the mausoleum. I ran without stopping until the forest shadows began to fade with the light of day. Only then did I allow myself to breathe calmly. But something had changed in me. I knew it. Though I had escaped physically, a part of me had been trapped in that mausoleum, and that absolute silence that seemed to devour everything in its path. I never knew exactly what I had seen or felt in that place. Perhaps I never will. But one thing is certain, the Mausoleum of Silence was not just a myth, not just a story to scare the curious. It was real, and what it held inside was something that did not belong to this world. Since that day, I have avoided talking about it. But every time I close my eyes, I can feel that cold, that silence, and the presence watching me from the shadows. And I know that, though I escaped, the Mausoleum of Silence will never let me go entirely. The cemetery looked different the last time I visited. The fog, which usually hovered over the graves at dusk, seemed denser, heavier, as if it held a secret it wasn't yet ready to reveal. I walked slowly among the withered tombstones, listening to the soft crunch of leaves beneath my feet. Something had brought me back, a feeling that there was still something I hadn't discovered, something the cemetery, in its enigmatic way, had been whispering to me during all my visits. The sense of unease that always accompanied me when I crossed the rusty gates of the place was familiar, but this time there was something more. An air charged with expectation, as if the cemetery knew I was approaching its final secret. As I made my way to the heart of the place, that forgotten corner where time seemed to have stopped, my mind kept replaying all the stories I had heard, all the legends and rumors surrounding this place. I had heard about ghosts wandering on full moon nights, about nameless graves that held more than just bodies, and about strange objects buried with the dead that were said to contain powers even the living didn't fully understand. But the story that disturbed me the most was one the cemetery caretaker had told me in a hushed voice on a rainy afternoon. It was the story of a sealed grave, one that should never be opened, for it held a secret so dark that its revelation could forever change the life of whoever discovered it. "It's not the grave you should fear," the caretaker had warned me with a gloomy glint in his eyes, "but what lies beneath it. Some secrets are meant to stay buried." Remembering his words now, as I approached that area, made my steps more cautious, heavier. What was really pushing me forward? Curiosity, no doubt, but also something deeper, something almost primal, the desire to understand what is hidden from us, to unveil the mysteries that have remained shrouded for centuries. Though I knew playing with the unknown carried its risks, something inside me urged me to continue. Finally, I stopped in front of the grave in question. It was simple, without any flashy adornments or epitaphs to distinguish it from the others. Yet something about it stood out. Perhaps it was the way the shadows seemed to cling to its edges, or how the silence around that spot became denser, more palpable. I knew this was the place I had been seeking, the cemetery's final secret. I knelt beside the gravestone and, with trembling hands, began to remove the dirt covering the edges. I didn't know exactly what I was expecting to find, but what happened next wasn't part of my plans. As I dug a little deeper, my fingers hit something hard. What I initially thought was a rock turned out to be a small box, covered in dirt and moss, but surprisingly intact. The box had no engravings, nothing to indicate its origin or purpose, but when I touched it, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The air around me seemed to stop for a moment, and time, that constant companion of life, lost its natural rhythm. I looked around. Everything appeared the same, yet something had changed. The cemetery, in some way, seemed to be holding its breath, as if it was waiting for my next move. I carefully opened the box. Inside, wrapped in a cloth worn by time, I found a small amulet. It was a simple figure, made of a dark metal I didn't immediately recognize. However, as I held it in my hands, I felt a deep connection, almost as if that object, that tiny piece of forgotten history, had been waiting for me all this time. It wasn't just any amulet. Something about its weight, its texture, told me it held an ancient power, one that had been carefully buried so that no one else would find it. But now, there it was, in my hands, ready to reveal its secrets. As I stared at it, I began to notice something strange around me. The shadows in the cemetery were lengthening, but not because of the sun, something darker, something that seemed to emanate from the amulet itself. The fog, which had once been just a thick layer of moisture, began to move, as if it had a life of its own, swirling around me, trapping me in a circle of silence. The cemetery was no longer just a resting place for the dead, now it was a stage, and I was its only spectator. The amulet vibrated slightly in my hands, and in that moment I knew it wasn't just an ancient object forgotten by time. It was a link, a connection to something much larger, more terrifying than I could imagine. Something the cemetery had been guarding all this time. Suddenly, everything made sense. The cemetery caretaker, the veiled warnings, the impenetrable silence of this place. The cemetery wasn't just a burial site, it was a guardian, a protector of secrets that were never meant to come to light. And I, in my insatiable quest to uncover the unknown, had broken that barrier. I stood still, feeling the weight of my discovery. I knew I had to make a decision. I could bury the amulet again, let the cemetery continue to be the keeper of its secrets, or I could take it with me, accept what I had unearthed, and face the consequences of my curiosity. But even as I thought of returning it, I felt it was already too late. Something had been unleashed, and there was no turning back. Finally, with a mix of fear and resignation, I wrapped the amulet back up and placed it in the box. As I left the cemetery, I knew my life would never be the same again. Although I had found the cemetery's final secret, I had left something of myself there, something I would never get back. That night, as I tried to sleep, the shadows seemed longer than usual, and the silence, deeper. I knew that the cemetery, with all it held, would never fully let me go.